I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a house or tried to live in a house whilst it's being renovated, whilst the plumbing and the electrics are kind of being pulled around and twisted and you've moved from room to room. I did it once, and then on the subsequent 2 occasions that I renovated a house, I rented somewhere and then went in and checked every so often. Now, why is this kind of relevant? Many of us in this room have been plumbers over the last 20, 30 years. And like Patrick, we've been involved in that plumbing and the electrics. And actually, it's a very good time to be a plumber because there's so much going on. In fact, it never stops. Every week there's something new. Every day there's something new on the plumbing front. And it's become a very difficult place for end clients, beneficial owners, never mind the banks, to actually operate in. And then if you throw in some of the geopolitics, and one of the things that I do at our firm, I look after, for my sins, I look after Brexit across all of our client engagements, be they in financial services, government, or corporates. And you throw in Brexit on top of everything else, and it becomes an extremely difficult place to live because you're never quite sure where your money is, you're never quite sure where your assets are, which legal framework they're under, which insolvency regime. At this moment in time, I'm poring over in documents and prospectuses for clients where they've got assets which they've consumer finance, for instance, where they take it from 10 different countries under a banking license. They then take those tranches, securitize it. They then turn it into a note which they list in Luxembourg, which is then documented under an investor prospectus in the UK under English law. These are very, very complex structures, and in and around them there is a whole set of movement around regulation and politics which bring a great deal of uncertainty to bear. So many of our clients come to people like me and say, what's going on? What do I do? How is this going to impact me? Is that issuance still valid? Is it not valid? Is it safe where it is? How much more is it going to cost next year versus this year? Will I be able to get that issuance away in the first quarter of the forthcoming year in Europe? These are big questions, and what we have is, and I think you saw it at the beginning of this session with Patrick Pearson speaking, is never mind Brexit, we have Europe and the US not exactly seeing eye to eye on some of the very big principles here. So all of this as a backdrop for a client is, an end client, is very difficult to understand. And if we go back to the first principles here, and I like to kind of sometimes go back to first principles on when we're looking at these issues, much of the regulation was about getting transparency, interoperability, portability, stability. Those are the 4 things that many of these things try to address. And I remember, the first piece of infrastructure that I was ever involved in, I was at Barclays and I was seconded to what was the G17 banks, became the G20, to program manage the setup of CLS the feasibility initially in 1996. That was a private sector initiative where there'd been a problem, Herstatt risk in this particular issue, and people were looking at things like payment versus payment and finality of payment and trying to solve those kind of issues. It was done collaboratively on a global basis with the private sector, with a little bit of encouragement, obviously, the BIS Red Book, but with the private sector going out and solving the problem, and everybody understanding what role they played in it. Now, this is pre-Euro, obviously, when the initial feasibility was being done. But those 17 banks worked together collectively in order to solve that problem and handed over the solution effectively to the Fed so that they could manage it. And, the bank, as you guys know, is domiciled in the US. And everybody accepted that solution. They didn't try to tinker with it afterwards. They didn't try to change it. They didn't turn it into a political argument. They just delivered the solution. And this is really important as well, because I think one of the things that Kirsten was alluding to, and I'd lift it above their kind of fintech or tech-fin debate, is about public sector and private sector partnership in solving these problems. I was at Eurofi I go to it every 6 months, and many of you guys do as well, I know. But I remember one of the heads of the ESA, when we were debating about contractual certainty, saying around Brexit, saying that it was a private sector problem to solve for, which he and I both knew was not the right answer, okay? Because the public sector needs to change laws at the same time as the private sector needs to adapt and repaper and so on in those circumstances. This, again, moving forward on market infrastructure, is about public sector and private sector working together. And trying to make some of this plumbing a little bit more simple than it has been made over the last few years. If you look at what Sam Woods is doing at the PRA at the moment, it's kind of interesting, because a lot of the things that they've done has really been gold plating of the standards, ring fencing of UK banks, etc., and the regulation around banking has been above and beyond what many other countries have done. But he's actually said, now's the time to pause, okay? And we got to pause. There's some recalibration that needs to get done, but we've made a complex structure, and now we need to make sure that the next thing we do is make it operationally resilient. Because the next set of threats, while we're playing around with this plumbing, is actually from things like cyber and state actors. Those are where the challenges come going forward, not necessarily interest rate swap derivatives and whether or not they're domiciled in London or in Frankfurt. That's not the big challenge right now. It's not the one that's top of mind at board level. If you go into any board in a real economy client, you'll find that geopolitics at the very highest level, trade wars, and cyber are the big issues that they're facing. They're not interested in the plumbing, in the sense of it being worried about it or be it changing again. They want to make sure that these things are now stable. And I think I'd like to leave with that thought. This is about moving from a wave of 10 years of regulation and beyond, and actually getting to a point where we stabilize the infrastructure now, where we make it simpler and easier for people to understand and use, because we're in danger of creating a monster. Thank you.